Alright guys, so we're in the booth right now. This is kind of my sort of spray setup here. You'll see I've got my vents here, which is actually an oven hood, but it was flipped over on its backside, and then I've got the vents running out through the window. This particular one moves about 250 cubic feet of air per minute. Looking up, in a confined space, I was suggested that that I get something that was over 170. Depending on the smaller booth and what kind of things you're spraying, you might be okay with something a little bit less. But because I tend to use a lot of lacquers and harsh solvent-based paints, that's what I decided to go for. So it's more than enough for the space that I have and for my particular needs. So we've got the MiG 17 here, all primed and ready to go, and we're going to be painting it with XF16, which is, to me, is flat aluminum. And so normally what I like to do is get the stir stick out and give the paint a really good stir. I was using this a little bit before, so it's not as clumped up as it normally is after a period of non-use. So what I usually do is just kind of use the flat end and just kind of scrape around the edge, because the bottom of the Tamiya paints they've kind of got a convex type shape to them, so you want to get in all the edges, make sure all the pigment is suspended, and then just scrape off all the excess, wipe that off, put it off to the side. So for this, I've got several different sort of airbrushes that I use, and I'll probably do a separate video on that, just to kind of show you what exactly I've got in a little bit more detail in the actual booth itself. But for this one, I'm using, I think this is a master airbrush. It's got a trigger style. This one's kind of nice because it lets in air first, kind of like on the press of a conventional airbrush, and then once you reach your point, then the actual needle moves. You can see there that the needle moves in the last little bit. It's really nice, and it's got a MAC valve as well. So we're just going to drop the air pressure down. It's around 25 psi. On my gauge at least. It might be different for some people. Again, it's just going to be a matter of you trying it out, testing it on spare bodies and spare fuselages, kind of paint mules as it were. A lot of people kind of say, there's this big argument of whether you mix in the airbrush or whether you mix outside of the airbrush, depending on what it is. For my 2K primers and 2K clears, the urethanes, I definitely like to mix them outside in a spare container, as well as I believe they're kind of something similar to, it's not a urethane, but it's a water-based two-part kind of balancing clear from Createx Colors, and they're kind of thinner that goes along with it because this stuff is pretty thick. But yeah, anything that's usually a two-part or a multi-part paint system, I'll usually mix outside of the airbrush, as well as custom colors for Tamiya mixes if I'm using two different colors, or if I'm mixing a clear and say a candy, I'll do that. But for most of the time, for single colors and thinner, I'll just mix it right into the airbrush cup. I got a little pipette here. I'm using X28 thinner. It's a little bit more gentle, kind of give me a little bit more of a matte finish. I'm going to mix up a 50-50 mix. So I'm using about 1.5 mils thinner. And one thing you probably should note is when you are mixing your paints and stuff inside or in your airbrush booth, usually keep everything clean, so I've wiped this all down prior to actually spraying, so there's no dust or particles that can get in the paint or in the paint cups. So once you're done using the paint cup, you know, you're going to take the lid off, obviously, but then close it back up right away, prevents debris from actually getting into the paint. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up. The flat aluminum now. For the smaller kind of paint canisters, like obviously you've got some pretty deep ones like MRPs and some splash paints, the larger zero cups. And for those you can use the larger pipettes, but for smaller, more precise mixtures, I tend to use these half mil little droppers. You usually find them on Amazon. They're like flavor droppers, that sort of thing. But I'll use those for smaller containers and smaller mixtures. So what I'm kind of doing right now is I'm going to the bottom of the airbrush, coming back up to the top of the ring, and then just releasing the liquid, kind of mixing it with the actual pipette that's in there. Down to the side, and then I'll just give it a quick little backflow to get everything outside, or get everything from the nozzle end back over so that it's mixed properly, and then just kind of test it out here. Make sure I've got good airflow. So what I'm going to do for this, where is it? There we go. So I'm just going to put my mask on. Let's see if it's a little easier to hear me. If not, well, safety over satisfaction. So I'm going to leave the fan off for now, but the nice thing about this fan here is it's actually got two fan settings. It's got a low setting and a high setting. So I'm just going to turn it on to the low setting here, and I'm going to go ahead and start spraying the model. I'm going to try and hit all of these small, actually no. That way I'm not muffled. What I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to go over all the tight areas of the model. So like these winglets here, inside all of the crevices, and then I'll move over to doing the broad areas, and we'll go ahead and get that started. So I'm going to try and commentate through this. But obviously with the fan going and with the mask on, it's going to be a little bit difficult, but just bear with me and we'll try and get through this. If anything, I'll just kind of I'll listen to the video afterwards, and if you can't hear me or I can't hear me, then we'll just kind of speed through it. Try a little bit of dry tip, clearing that out, some thicker paint.
So with metallics and stuff, especially with some of Tamiya's metallics, what'll happen is the paint and the particles will actually start to, they won't be suspended in the actual liquid depending on how much you put in your airbrush and how long it takes you to spray. So occasionally what I'll do is just kind of put a little bit of back pressure on the airbrush and get those particles resuspended in the actual paint mixture. One thing I'm careful to do here, especially with such a thin down mixture, is I'm not trying to flood the area with paint to get perfect coverage right off the bat. I'm going in with very thin coats and then supplementing that with just air from the airbrush. So what that's going to do is it's going to help me get a nice even coat. I'm going to be able to flash off the paint a lot sooner, and I'm not going to worry about getting too much paint on the actual surface and risk it running. So just remember that a few smaller coats at a time is often a lot better than putting a whole bunch of paint down on once just to get coverage. Okay, so I've got all of the tight spots here on the top done, especially with the Tamiya paints because they can take so long to dry. Honestly, compared to lacquers, which are almost instantly flashed off and cured, what I want to do is I want to make sure that the top half is going to be done first, and that'll give me time to make sure I can put a sealing coat over top of this. Wait for that to dry, and then I'll flip it over and I'll do the bottom half, and that way I won't risk, especially on something like a paint stand where the paint is still tacky, that it'll actually pull off onto the stand, leaving little circular marks on the surface, which means I'll have to resand, reprime, repaint. So it just cuts out that second step to having to hassle over it. So I'm going to go ahead here now and paint the rest of the aircraft. Higher here. Alright, so as you can see here, it's got one half of the fuselage already done. Now the reason, there's a couple of reasons, but The reason why I usually use black for lighter colors like a silver base or for natural metal is uh, one part is that it takes less paint to cover the black surface, especially if you have a high build paint. It helps you see where you've missed spots so you get a nice even coat, as well as using less paint because it stands out so much. Excuse me. For stuff like cars, though, if I'm using a bright color like a red, a yellow, or a vibrant blue or green, what I'll tend to do is use a lighter gray, and what that'll do is it's a darker color on top of a lighter color. I'll get better coverage that way, and helps the color pop a little bit better. So that's what you're wondering why I try this in black and not in gray. It also helps too when I'm doing something with a camouflage pattern and I'm trying to get a varied finish on it. Eventually I'll probably show you guys how I do that, but it's a term called black basing, and what that help does is it adds depth to the paint, and it also creates total variance when you use the modeling technique. So I'm going to continue spraying that, but that's just in case you guys are wondering why I use a black instead of a gray to prime it. Alright, so we're out of paint. We almost got the last step of the way. But I think I'll just leave it there. So that's how we go about approaching getting my paint started, getting ready. If you guys want to see, actually, hold on. I don't know.
Alright, so that's how I go ahead and start painting my models. If you guys want something more in-depth, I'm probably going to do a video on my entire spray booth, all the various airbrushes that I use and where I use them in. Or if you want a little bit more in-depth on painting techniques and how to paint, we can go through that as well. I just have to figure out a better camera angle, obviously, than just a normal tripod. So let me know what you guys think. This will be the end of part 5 for the MiG 17 build. So go ahead and like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, if you want to see more, and then leave a comment if you've got something interesting that you want to add or questions that you have, and I'll try and answer them. But for now, we'll see you guys in the next episode.